Well, welcome everyone. It is June 5th, 2020, and we are all in Yellow Springs, Ohio, although in different locations. And we have with us today Susan Jennings, the Executive Director of Community Solutions, and our guest today is Marianne MacQueen, who has a long history with Community Solutions. I am Megan Bachman. I'm the editor of the Yellow Springs News, and this is the first of our series. So welcome everyone. So here we are in 2020. It's been quite the year. We've had a global pandemic that's led to unprecedented lockdowns, shelter-in-place orders. Our economy has come to a halt. We have one of the worst unemployment rates since the Great Depression. We have coming up one of the most consequential elections in American history. Some are saying that our very democracy is at stake. At the same time, this week, we have had social unrest from ongoing issues of police brutality against people of color, and increasingly aggressive responses from police in the state. So we are at a time of really unprecedented uncertainty, not only just about the next few years, but the next few months and weeks. And we are launching this series in order to both ground us in this historical moment and to prepare for the future. This morning I was thinking about Joanna Macy's concept of the great unraveling, and it feels like many of our institutions are unraveling before our very eyes. Institutions that maybe never met the needs of people on the planet very well in the beginning. So as we have this unraveling of everything around us, it's kind of a scary time, but it's also a time of possibility. There's been many people that have been weaving the threads of a new story for many generations. And one of those people we have with us today, Marianne MacQueen. Marianne is the Vice President of Yellow Springs Village Council and liaison to the Environmental Commission. She has a long history with the Community Land Trust movement and with Community Service, the organization name for Community Solutions, as well as Arthur Morgan. So Marianne will be speaking with us about her vision for the post-COVID future and what we can do now in our community to move towards a more resilient and sustainable place. So welcome, Marianne.
Thank you.
Great, thanks so much for that introduction, Megan. Megan and I and Marianne have interesting things in common, primarily that we all came to Yellow Springs because of the vision of Arthur Morgan, who founded in 1940 Community Service, which became Community Solutions a couple of decades ago. Marianne, could you share with us your history with Community Service and with the Village of Yellow Springs?
Sure. I came to Yellow Springs in 1972, and I was 27 years old. I was married to a guy who had done all of his academic research on Arthur Morgan. And so he came to Yellow Springs to work at Community Service, as it was called then. I came to Yellow Springs, well, I came with him, but I came to Yellow Springs because of the Yellow Springs News, actually, because we were living in Nashville, Tennessee, going to Vanderbilt. And he would get the Yellow Springs News because he was working on Arthur Morgan. And I fell in love with Yellow Springs through the Yellow Springs News, and that was really my impetus for coming to Yellow Springs. So we came to Yellow Springs and we separated very quickly. And he stopped working for Community Service, and I started working for Community Service. So that's how I started. And at that point, it was a collective with Faith Morgan, who's Arthur Morgan's granddaughter, and Don Hollister, who still lives here and is now a Miami Township trustee, Catherine Hitchcock, who has been a therapist, worked at the News, and I, and Grista Morgan at that time, who is Arthur's second son, was really leading Community Service at that point. I've had an eclectic career in Yellow Springs, and I've always chosen to stay here, even though I left 2 different times to study, once to study massage, once to study conflict resolution, but I always came back. And so I chose this place over any particular career. And I chose this place because I so much valued the community and still do. When I came here, I felt like I had come home, and I didn't know what home felt like, I think, until I came here. So, as I said, I've had an eclectic career. I've been a cook in a restaurant. I spent 15 years doing home construction and remodeling. I've spent more, I think maybe about 20 years leading various nonprofits and helping to start a community daycare center, which we call the Infant Center. I helped start the Village Mediation Program, and I helped start the Community Land Trust, Yellow Springs Home Inc. So now I'm on Village Council. It's sort of the culmination of my wayward career path. It's always felt like I was going in some direction, but I did a lot of different things.
And Marianne, what is this concept? It seems like you've been a student of community your life. Can you share what it means to you, the concept of community?
Yes. I feel teary. I think the first thing that it meant for me was feeling that I could be who I was, and that I could do what I wanted to do. For example, I rebuilt the engine on my VW, which I had no experience in doing. This was probably a couple years after I had moved here, because there were a couple guys. Joe Ayers, who still lives here, was one of them. Pat Ertl was the other. And they said, okay, yeah, come on, we have this little car shop and we'll help you as you need it, rebuild the engine of your car. So I just felt like I could do whatever I wanted to do, and that I would be totally accepted for who I was. And I did. And I pretty much am accepted for who I am, I think.
Wonderful. It seems like that has been a thread through Yellow Springs' history. I'm curious what has changed in Yellow Springs since your time here, since you came in the 60s?
Ilse Tebbets, who was also one of the founders, both were the Tecumseh Land Trust, which is the Farmland Conservation Land Trust, and Home Inc. I credit this saying to her that we've been a victim of our success. Yellow Springs has been a community, not perfect, of course, but has been a community, I think, my sense is, ever since its history, and it's never gotten very large. And in the past 30 years, I guess, starting maybe with the 90s, maybe before, people in the surrounding area really started understanding the value of community, I think, in various ways, whether it was the Glen or our schools, or that it was safe, or that they could come and be accepted, whatever. So people started moving here, which drove up the cost of housing. That's had a huge negative impact on the community, I think. And we've become a tourist destination. And that has had, while it has helped some downtown businesses and probably helped at least some people in the arts, I think has had a negative impact on the sense of community in Yellow Springs. And things that at one point were community events now have become larger events, such as the street fair or the 4th of July fireworks, as two examples. So I think people, it's a really hard thing. There's no easy solution, but I think that's been a change.
You wrote a lot about community when you were director of community service from 1998 to 2001, 4 years, producing, for example, the Community Journal with lots of great writing from folks in Yellow Springs and further afield. What was your vision for the organization and for Yellow Springs at that time?
And the Community Journal was really the brainchild of Don Wallace, who had been the editor of the Yellow Springs News and has been an author, friend of Wendell Berry, I think. The journal previous to that had been very small, and it was really his vision to change it into something that would have a focus about community and the sense of community, and for the most part use people in Yellow Springs and situations in Yellow Springs as the focus. So I became the director. I was the first non-family member to be the director of community service. And I would say until that time, the organization had been whatever the family had wanted it to be, in particular, what Arthur had wanted it to be. He was very practical and charismatic and had a large international following. So it was sort of, I think, a vehicle for him to do whatever work he wanted to do, whether it was education, economy, community. And then it moved from him to his son Griscom and then Griscom's wife Jane, and was struggling, I think, to find a focus. So I was brought in as the director. I'd never done anything like that. And I struggled to find the focus. So I sort of was trying different things, one of which was to focus on the small community and use Yellow Springs as an example and talk about sense of place and what that meant. And some of the conferences that we had to do with that. And then the other focus was about sustainability. And we did some workshops and conferences on that. The same kind of issues we were aware of in the 90s are what are becoming more and more critical, 30 years, almost 30 years later. But I wasn't successful, which is why I wasn't successful in finding a focus for the organization that could move it into the future.
So the next era of community service was actually changing its name to Community Solutions and looking at peak oil and climate change and kind of positioning community as the solution to those new challenges that were arising, which is where I came into the picture. And I worked with Pat Murphy, Faith's husband, came to lead the organization. He wrote a book called Plan C. And we were chatting last week, Marianne, about some of the, you read that recently and had some thoughts about how that could be kind of a good frame for thinking about Yellow Springs and how do we transition our community in the wake of all these challenges. Can you share a little bit about that?
So when we went into the shelter in place, I did. And I had the luxury of being able to do that because council and council work really took a back seat to a network that was formed through the Community Foundation. And I was involved in that, but I wasn't in a critical role. So after sort of flailing a little bit for the first week or so to figure out, well, what am I going to do? I just stepped back, and I really value that time. And I understand how fortunate I was because not everyone had the luxury of stepping back. And in stepping back, I started reading things that normally I wouldn't necessarily have been reading. And one of the first things that impressed on me was an article about how times like the impact of the COVID, where there's this crisis, are also times where a change can happen that might not normally happen. So that was the first thing. And then it made me start thinking about the impact of the so-called supply chain. In particular, people have talked about food supply chain. The other thing that came up as people recognizing was things like the United States no longer made face masks. A lot of things that were needed for the COVID, it was being made in China. So I had been thinking about that, and then I remembered about Pat's book, Plan, I don't know, Plan C, I think that was the name of his book, which at the time I did not read, truthfully, because I thought, well, I know what he's talking about and it's just too depressing. But I decided this time that I would read it. And it's definitely worth people looking at because it puts in so vividly the context in which we live of extracting fossil fuels, extracting minerals, extracting whatever it is we can, including the labor of people who on whose backs or necks, whatever, we are trotting to get our stuff, and being in this system that is so compelling to always be getting more and more stuff and working harder and harder and harder. And actually, I forget what your question was now. But anyway, that was what I was thinking of, and it made me realize that now in Yellow Springs, we may have the opportunity to move forward some of the kind of things that we have talked about for at least 20 years.
Absolutely. And you were sharing as well the idea of thinking about a community, not in a linear sense, but in more of a cyclical way. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yes. So what I was realizing, especially with Pat's book, and it's not that it's a new idea, but I'm using an iPad. I'm looking at you with an iPad. I suppose the iPad was made in China, but I have no idea any one person who was involved in this iPad, except I met someone at the Apple store. And it's like, we take this stuff, we use it, and then we throw it away. And this is a huge problem. Whereas in a community that is functioning well as a community, I'm going to go down to the hardware store and see Gila or Chep. And, I don't know who made what I'm buying, but at least I'm having that personal relationship. And I am taking the money that I got, say, as being a council member, or I was doing Airbnb in my house, but anyway, and I'm giving it to them. Or I go to the farmer's market and I see Michelle Burns and I buy something from her. And the ideal thing is that there is this cyclical relationship, whether it's that the money travels or whether my neighbor Bruce Parker sells me at hardly anything, some scrounged screen doors, and I've just put them on my garden that I've just fenced in because of our deer, because our relationship with the deer is not cyclical. So in a community, it's that idea of cooperation and things, whether it's food or money or I do this for you and then you do this for someone else, that kind of organic relationship that is what life is itself. We have been living in an artificial, we live in an artificial and unsustainable life that is going to crash and is crashing. Unfortunately, as with most things, the people that feel the crash are the poor people.
So Megan started this by talking about the fact that we're all very interested in thinking about how this period that we're living through, or hopefully thriving through, is providing opportunities for change. Maybe just to set the context for that, Marianne, you could talk about what's happened in Yellow Springs over the last couple months, because there certainly have been some positive outcomes, and then also some things that have been real challenges for folks. So maybe you could give us a sense of both of those.
Yeah. So I'm going to just first start with myself personally. As I said, for me, this time has been a pause. It's also been a drop in income because, as I mentioned, I did rent out a bedroom on Airbnb, and that income that I get from that is the income that I could use to fly to Seattle or which I was going to do, or fly to Sweden to see my son, or all these different sort of extra activities, which I'm not doing. And I'm happy. I want to see my son clearly, and I'd like to see friends in Seattle. But it's made me realize that I can live on much less than I have been, and I am still like at the under 80% of the area median income. So, and that is part of community too, I think. So for some of us, I'm hopeful that we'll be able to find a way to go, oh, like to relax, to step back, to not keep up this fast pace that we now have in this society, and say, okay, I'm not going to drive to Trader Joe's. I'm not going to do this. I'm just going to enjoy being at home or enjoy walking on the bike path or whatever. But in going back to your question, what happened, I think, was that the Yellow Springs Community Foundation in particular, and Gina Marie Cox is the head of that organization, really stepped up to the plate. And they helped create what they called a leadership group, which I think was about 30 people from different groups. And they started looking at what are the needs in the community now, and how can we organize the community so that those needs are being met, so that we know who needs what and that the needs are being met. And the village government was involved. Our village manager has been hosting these town halls. So it really was a way of the community coming together, somewhat organically, or maybe as a network, I'd say. And I think that it has shown that this COVID situation has shown, one, the importance of towns, of communities, of towns, of state government. I never used to watch the Ohio channel on PBS. Why? I would watch the national news. Now, I started watching the Ohio channel. And part of that is because of the dysfunction at the federal level, which has been a blessing in some ways, because I think it's made us understand how important it is to work at how important the grassroots, the local level is, and the state government as well.
Wonderful. And final question for you, Marianne. What do you hope to see Yellow Springs do in the next few months or a few years, perhaps, to kind of move us closer to that vision of community that you described?
Yeah. So there's this organization that I'm a member of, or maybe I call it a movement. I'm going to put the book up here. I don't know if you can see. Can you see this? No. The organization is called Strong Towns. And several of us in Yellow Springs listened to a webinar that organization gave recently. And what they said, the first two things that a community needs to do is make sure people are fed and make sure that they are housed. And that is what this group has been doing, that I was mentioning, that has been organized by the Community Foundation. So those are the first two things. And we have been doing that. That still is happening. Still, people are still doing, whether it's our little, what do they call it, little boxes with the little community food pantries, or the food pantry. There are various ways that we're making sure that people are fed. And housing is more difficult, but there is a group working on that. The village government has been doing some things to help shore up, to help ensure that people are not kicked out of their houses. So I think that is the most immediate thing. The other things that I think we can be doing more long-term are focusing on the kind of activities that we can do to bring home the most important services that are I'm not going to say low-hanging fruit, because none of it I don't think is particularly easy. But so I made a list of them. The food system. we live in a very rich agricultural region. We have plenty of water. Uh, it's not easy to switch from a global food system to a local regional, but that is something we can do. And I think Community Solutions, I think, is working on that, Council Land for us. That I think that is probably the most straightforward thing we can do. Another thing is housing. Housing is much more difficult. And as you know, I've worked in affordable housing for fairly long time. And I know how difficult it is. And housing in general is difficult because it's become so expensive. But what I have been considering recently is that while we don't have enough housing units for our population in this country, one of the reasons we don't is because we have fewer people living in each housing unit. For example, I own a double in an older part of town, and I'm one person. I live on one side, and I have one person living on the other side. But I know that there were families that lived on both sides at one point. So there are probably about 4 people living on both sides at one. There are probably 8 people living in this one house double, where we now have 2. And I look across the street, and it's the same or even bigger houses with 1 or 2 people. So if Yellow Springs could start putting an effort on looking at these big houses that we have with few people in them and start really creating a movement for more, whether it's shared housing or creating doubles or triples in houses, like a lot of the older rental units in town, that's what they are. They were probably one house, and then they were divided into 2 or 3 or 4. So that's something I've been thinking about recently. Third thing, home business. We already have home businesses. The more we can encourage home businesses, the more we can encourage people from working from home, the better it helps on not using fuel. People don't have to drive. And also, if you live and work in your community, you're much more tied to the community. You have more time to be involved in the community. So other areas that we already have things going on, health and wellness is another area I think that we can focus on, education, the arts. And to the degree that we have a tourist economy, the more I think we can focus on having that be people come maybe to do a workshop, people come to go to a concert. People come because of our health and wellness activities, as opposed to coming downtown to just walk around because they don't have a downtown, I guess, themselves, which that's sad. Local investing also. So those are things that I think of in terms of directions.
That'll take us a few months or so anyway.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We were looking at the long term. I wasn't looking at just a couple months.
No,
I was looking at the years.
No, that was really wonderful. Thanks for taking us throughout your history and Community Solutions history and some of Yellow Springs. It was really a great introduction to this series. And want to remind folks that this is co-sponsored by the Yellow Springs News, of which Megan is the editor, and by Community Solutions, which I serve currently as the executive director. And we welcome your comments and questions or ideas for upcoming webinars. You can find information below where this is posted. And next up, we will have Michael Schumann next week, who is an expert on local investing, and I'm sure he'll follow up on some of the great suggestions that Marianne had today. So thanks, Marianne, and thanks, Megan, and look forward to seeing you around the village.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank
Bye.
you.